Hello and welcome to today's live stream session. Lionbridge has a guest speaker from CSA Research, Dr. Arle Lommel, presenting on the topic, How Much Should Enterprises Localize? Questions can be submitted in the chat during the presentation. Now let's dive right in. Thank you for joining us today, Arle. You may now begin.
All right, thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. As already mentioned, my name is Arle Lommel, and I'm a senior analyst with CSA Research. Today I'm going to be presenting on the issue of depth of localization. That's a concept I'll explain in a bit. But in recent years, CSA Research has gathered data on millions of web pages and hundreds of languages to deliver a wealth of information about how deeply major brands localize their content. This data provides us with insight into how organizations choose which languages to localize into, and crucially, how much content they localize into those languages. To accomplish this today, we'll be talking about some of the factors that influence language selection strategies and how CSA Research's reports and the data we have can help you make data-driven decisions. First, I'll be discussing what we mean by localization depth and some of the findings in our research. And second, I'll present a fictionalized case, but based on realistic data, to show how organizations select languages and how much they should localize for particular needs. And then finally, we'll close with a few recommendations that you can use for building your own localization strategy. Now, just as a few words about CSA Research, if you don't know us, we're a primary market research firm that focuses on the language industry. If you think of Forrester or Gartner or something like that, but with this specific focus on issues around international content and international business as it relates to language. We work with the constituencies you see on the screen. Big one is buyers of language services, but we also work with language service providers like Lionbridge and others. We interview freelancers, the people who provide services in the industry. And then we also conduct research with global buyers of localized products. And I'll be actually talking a bit about some of the results from that to contextualize what I'll be saying. And then we also work with technology vendors. Now, without further ado, then I'm going to jump into the topic of today's presentation. In this first section, we'll discuss what localization depth is to address the basic question of how much content you should localize. We'll also examine how language selection affects depth and some of the factors we observed in our examination of over 1,300 multilingual websites. We actually looked at almost 3,000 websites from major brands, but of course a lot of them were English only or Chinese only. So in this we'll be looking at the subset of 1,300, over 1,300 websites that had multilingual content. And between them all, that's actually millions of individual web pages we had to examine. So let's start with what localization depth is. Most research on language selection focuses on localization breadth. So I'm going to start with what localization depth isn't. Breadth is how many languages are provided by a company. So you can frame it as the question, how many languages should you add and which ones? This factor is relatively easy to observe, and of course it's economically important. You can go to a website, you can count how many languages appear in a language selection mechanism, and then you know which languages are supported. But it doesn't provide you with any guidance as to how much content should appear in each language. To get at this factor, we need to look at depth, which CSA Research defines as the percentage of content in the source language site that appears in each target site. To measure this factor in the data I'm presenting today, we use the open source Common Crawl database of web content and analyzed over 3 million web pages on major brand sites using the fast text library from Facebook. It's an open source library that Facebook provided to determine the source language and the language of each of the target pages. After excluding monolingual sites and pages where the language was not clear to fast text or where no linguistic content was present, we had information on 2.4 million pages from 1,348 multilingual websites. The depth figures that we find, oh, and I should mention we're also working on a new version now with approximately 3,000 websites total, and we're changing methods to get even better data. Now, depth figures are a good proxy for how much brands invest in particular languages. However, you do need to be aware that when I present these figures, that the results do not tell us how much they are investing in the present. Languages that companies added early on may receive only maintenance later on, while investment is heavier in newer languages or more strategic opportunities. For example, a US-based company may have more content in Spanish than in German due to past domestic requirements, and yet find German to be a more strategic opportunity now and be investing more heavily in the present. As a result, depth figures can't tell you how much you should be spending at a particular time, but they can give you a sense of what cumulative investment is in particular industry sectors or by particular companies, how much they've invested in languages in total. In addition, we did find low depth for some languages that may not be real localization targets. For many sites, we found very low levels of contents in languages that don't appear in site navigation. In most cases, these were individual pages that were created for specific purposes outside of formal localization management channels. It's also complicated by the use of user-generated content, which may appear in languages that organizations don't support at all. You can think of going to Amazon and seeing a review that somebody's put in Polish, for instance, on the US site. So sometimes these things show up and create a low level of noise around other languages. Before moving on, I want to present some basic statistics about depth. For these statistics, we examined only those sites that have some localized content, and we excluded monolingual sites. First, the average depth of localized sites in our sample was 10%. That means that only 1 in 10 pages present in the source will appear in any given target. Of course, this average conceals considerable variation from almost complete localization in some sites and some languages to very low levels in others. Now, only 3.7% of sites have full localization, which we defined as having 90% or more of the source content in at least one target. This means that full localization is the rare exception rather than the norm. And for those of you who are looking at how you define your localization budgets, that's a good thing because it says that you can stretch them further by being selective in what you localize. Now, we found also that when sites double in size, only 38% of the new content is translated into any language. So sites get bigger, and we'll see this clearly in just a few moments. Smaller and smaller percentages of content are localized, even as total volumes do go up. Now, we also discovered that 60% of the variation in localization depth is attributable to site size. Smaller sites simply have greater depth than larger, more complex corporate sites, which really shouldn't be surprising. It's much easier to localize a site with 300 pages than to localize one with 100,000 pages. And we'll see exactly how that plays out here. As I mentioned, localization depth falls rapidly as site size increases. Our model predicts that depth should approach 100% for very small sites. However, this relationship breaks down. For sites with fewer than 100 source pages, size is actually a poor predictor of depth. Organizations with very small sites are actually less likely to have a systematic localization program, regardless of how large the brand is. But by the time sites have more than a few thousand source pages, average localization depth, which you can see in the slide as the green line, actually falls to very small numbers. Similarly, as sites add more languages, the average depth for all languages falls quite rapidly. As you can see here, if you have just one language, the average depth is somewhere over 20%. I don't remember the exact number. But by the time you hit 20 languages, the average depth is only about 5%. And by the time you hit 70, it's just down to about 1%. And you may ask, well, what happens with bigger sites? We didn't have enough sites with languages more than 70 to start calculating an average. So that's the exception. If you think of sites like Google or Facebook. They're really the exception. But you can see that there is this rapid drop-off in total depth. Now, when we ranked target languages by depth, we found a predictable decay pattern at work. Each additional language a site adds receives increasingly less depth. This chart covers only the 54 sites in the sample that had at least 20 targets to allow us to see how adding languages affects depth within highly multilingual sites. What these results show us is that sites put an emphasis on a handful of languages and add others at much lower levels. So again, you can see the figure, the average and the median, but the average is almost 25% of the first language is localized. But by the time you add a second language, that drops to about 18%, and the third is less than 10%. So a couple factors influence this pattern we see. The first is that the longer a company has worked with a language, the more content it will have in that language. As they add additional languages, each one starts out at a lower level and only builds up over time. And second, enterprises target economically important opportunities first. Subsequent languages typically address increasingly smaller markets and so may not justify the same level of investment. Note as well that major multilingual sites typically have 5 or 6 Tier 1 languages as core languages. Tier 1 are those that CSA Research defines as having the largest economic potential. And we have information on that. If anyone's curious, you can reach out to me later. But as these sites add additional languages, they fall out of these Tier 1 languages. And so there's much less economic opportunity available from them. In addition, as you can note, the average here is substantially higher than the median, which means that a relatively small number of these sites localize at a much greater depth than the vast majority. Now, before going on, I want to talk about some of the dangers that can happen with insufficient localization. So I'm going to talk about average depths. But whenever I talk about this, you have to keep in mind that the depth that makes sense for you as a company will vary considerably from any average. So CSA Research conducted a survey of 8,709 consumers in 29 markets worldwide. And through our survey vetting process to try and find qualified respondents, we discarded almost 30,000 respondents who didn't meet our requirements so that we could find ones who were really representative of each country. And then we asked them questions about their buying behavior. These were people who engaged in online commerce. Now, the first one we asked about was about preference for products with information in their own language. And what we found, I don't have the key here, but the blue is people who strongly agree with the sentiment. The light blue is ones who agree. The light gray is ones who disagree, and the very dark gray are ones who strongly disagree. And so when we asked them, when faced with the choice of purchasing two similar products, whether they're more likely to purchase the one that has product information in their language, we found that 76% agreed or strongly agreed. And what this means is if you're not providing product information in their language, 76% of them are at risk of going to competitors that offer content in their language. Now, I'll just add, I don't have a slide about this, but you may say, yeah, but we work in Germany and Germans all speak English, or we're in the Netherlands and Dutch people all speak English. But we found that these numbers actually are pretty invariant depending on the language that people speak. And that's partially because in countries where there's high English language knowledge, these people are also used to having lots of content in their languages. And so they can afford to be picky and choosy, and they don't need to use English, and they don't want to, even though they could. So even if you think, well, we don't really need English for our we don't need another language for our market, be cautious in making that assumption. Now I'll just show three more of these statements in the agreement. We found that 41% of people are at risk if you don't have user instructions in their language in a user manual. And then almost identical to that first chart, we found that 75% are less likely to make purchases if you don't have after in their language. And as we'll see shortly, some of this information is typically not localized. So a lot of companies, by opting for low localization depth, leave some customers at risk. And then finally, something that often people don't think about, 73% of people, of our respondents, would be more willing to buy if you had user reviews in their language, even if you don't have other content. People are hungry to see what their peers think. And so traditional localization strategies often don't consider this, and the depth of localization for that kind of content is typically quite low. Now, after we evaluated depth by individual language in our survey of the sites, we discovered that English source sites show very low localization depth. When looking at how many of the pages on a multilingual English source site are translated into any language, the figure is just 14.5% compared to 45% of pages in French source language sites that are translated. You can see English is well below all of these other languages. All of the other major source languages we examined show significantly greater depth than English when translated. This result tells us that brands treat English as enough for much of their content. Now, there is some justification of this. English is the most widely spoken second language in the world, and if you're only going to have content in one language, it does make sense to have it in English in most cases. Although we could not ask site creators why they localize less going out of English than from other language, this economic importance is probably the major factor. They have a lot of content in English that they may not feel needs to be translated, either because the English-speaking market is so large or because the particular content is of low value and they figured that anyone who actually does need it can make do with English or online translation. For similar reasons, English target sites actually show much greater depth than any other language at 31.9%, compared to French in second place at 15.8%. Here, brands are pragmatically targeting English for greater depth because it does represent that big economic opportunity and provides the greatest geographic coverage of any possible target. Most brands from non-English speaking countries start their localization with English and then add other languages only as needed. Now, obviously, there are exceptions. Some Eastern European companies do target Russian first, but there is this overall pref for languages of broader communication, such as English, French, Spanish, Russian, or Portuguese. But you can see that the depth rapidly falls. And we have data on additional languages, but these were just the top ones. And you can see that by the time you hit Vietnamese at the end here, it's really only about 2% that's localized into it. So what do these results mean for you? First, in your strategy, you should balance breadth and depth. Knowing that the average target depth is 10% gives you a rough idea of how much you might want to be localizing overall. Now, at the same time, keep in mind that the average depth for the first target you go into is much higher. So your goal in your strategy will be to maximize your reach while still having enough depth to attract and keep customers. This means that localization depth should be driven by both your market opportunity and your customer base. Balancing these factors can be difficult. When you first add a language, you may not yet have sales to justify a large investment, but you may not be able to gain those sales and meet customer requirements without sufficient depth. So it creates a bit of a chicken and an egg problem. The challenge is to keep from overextending your effort in the beginning. The proper balance will vary for different enterprises, but examining your competitor sites in terms of their breadth and depth can help you benchmark yourself against them. As a general principle, if you're uncertain about what to invest in, adding languages is often a safer bet than drilling down for an existing one. However, pay attention to customer demands and requests. The last thing you want is unhappy customers. Next, plan a content sequence. The data that we have suggests that you should start with branding pages. That's not surprising. You're not going to have a site without them. These serve a core marketing function and help you build market awareness. You'll need these pages before you can deploy any other content in any event. And consistently, we see that these are the first pages localized. After your branding pages are in place, it's an obvious choice to move on to product pages. These support your sales function and provide the information your customers need to buy your goods or services. And I should pause and note here that many enterprises do a good job of reaching this point, but then they leave the commerce aspect out. They'll get people right up to the point where they have to make a payment, order something, subscribe to something, and then they're dumped back into English. And this is a strong disincentive. So make sure that when you're doing this, you don't leave out your e-commerce function, your payment portals, and similar things. Okay, after you've got these items, then you can move on to support. And you should do this only after you've got these other materials available. And after you have the customers that justify the expense. Our research finds that most enterprises offer support in only a handful of languages, usually far fewer than they offer other content in. If you're worried about customer satisfaction, here's a choice to look at MT, either raw or post-edited, as you move into support. And it's a good excuse to engage with an LSP that can provide these services. Now, everything else, such as social media and communities, is really a good case for raw MT. These often don't justify human translation, and even post-editing may be too expensive and too slow. So examples of this content include social media, community pages, AV content, and other items that don't directly support your sales function, but do help build brand awareness. Finally, adjust the numbers to reflect your site's size, complexity, and the number of languages. When benchmarking your site against competitors, make sure that they are apples to apples comparisons. Don't worry if your site with 40,000 pages and 20 languages shows lower depth than a competitor with 500 pages and 3 targets. These sites would not be comparable in terms of function and reach. Now, having gone through that, I'm going to walk you now through a hypothetical example to show how a company might combine the strategy guidance that you can get from looking at choosing the right languages. That's a subject I didn't really go into depth into, but there is a hierarchy in which companies typically add languages. I'll show how they can combine that with depth research to suggest an optimal localization strategy. In this particular example, I'm using a fictional company called Rolifont. The numbers I'm using here are made up and not meant to resemble any particular company, although they're broadly speaking quite realistic. If you want to apply this approach, you'll obviously need to substitute in realistic figures for your market. In its marketing speak, this company offers what it calls the new personal mobility solution. And imagine with that whatever you will. I'd like to think of something like a Segway, but we'll say that it's a relatively expensive device for personal transportation. The company was founded in 2005, but really grew in market share starting in 2013. Since then, it's captured 10% of the US market for personal mobility solutions and sells about 40,000 units per year. Units have a lifespan of about 5 years, and the company has high customer satisfaction rating and repeat sales. As a result, it predicts that sales in the US will be stable and grow modestly. Now, these units sell for about $3,000 US a year, giving the company domestic sales of around $120 million. Because of demands from investors, the company wants to increase sales by going overseas. Typical model that many of you will be familiar with. It's important to note that sales happen through showrooms where customers can test out their device, but most of the marketing is done online. Market research has shown that the typical customer for the Rolifont has an income of at least $30,000, and sales drop off sharply below that point. Now, the company has a relatively immature localization function that has covered French and Spanish for about 3 years just to service the North American market, but it's now shifted to a Europe-first strategy to leverage these languages via showrooms in France and Spain. In these markets, they have sales goals of about 10,000 units a year in France and 3,000 in Spain, but Spain has been disappointing as their goal really was about 6,000. So now the question is, if they're going to expand, what makes sense? At the first level, we start out with eGDP figures. These are from one of CSA Research's reports called Multilingual Digital Opportunity. And in this example, we're only looking at tier 1 language. Those earlier, they're the top languages. But in your own efforts, you may want to include other tiers or look at regional data. All of that's available through CSA Research if you need those figures. But you start with them, and here we're looking at, we include the percentage of world opportunity, that's the percentage number, and then the per capita figure for each one. So how much money do individuals tend to make? Now, based on Rolofont's strategy of Europe First, it's going to set aside large opportunities such as simplified Chinese and Japanese, just because it's not building out there. It may revisit them later, and these attractive opportunities would require too much investment in other areas such as regulatory clearance and building up a shipment network to make sense in the present. So the company identifies 7 potential languages, the ones highlighted on screen, as being ones that it may want to consider: German, Portuguese, Italian, Russian, Dutch, Swedish, and Turkish. However, the figures that I've shown represent global opportunity, and so the company needs to dig a bit deeper to find the European potential for these languages. In this case, only Portuguese really showed a significant change because excluding the Brazilian market cuts its potential significantly, but it does result in a higher per capita income level. That means a greater percentage of people in Portuguese speakers could afford a Rolofont, but it's still a very small opportunity. However, when we look at this, the low income levels for Russian and Turkish remove them from consideration in this. There's just not enough people who might buy this. After adjusting for income, only about 10% of Russian speakers could afford one of these, which cuts the relevant share of eGDP. That's, I should have explained that earlier, that's online GDP, so the spending potential of people you can influence with digital marketing. It ends up cutting that to about 0.2%. Now, Turkey actually fares slightly better in this regard. About 15% of speakers could afford one, but it isn't enough to save the language in this equation. So now they're down to 5 potential candidates. And at this point, based on these, they need to see what are their competitors doing. Now, first, Rolofont reviews CSA Research's figures for target language by industry. There's not a perfect industry fit in what we've done. We look at over 30 industries, but Rolofont's executives decide that transportation services may be relevant and find that Portuguese, German, Polish, Danish, and Dutch are the next most popular European languages. As a result, they dig a little bit further, but decide that the Portuguese market remains too small and that Polish doesn't offer enough high-income earners. However, they decide to put Danish into the running for later expansion, even though that didn't already show up. The company also examines the sites of major competitors and finds that they prefer Chinese and Japanese because of differences in regional strategy. Those that do target Europe prefer German and Italian, which increases the pressure to localize into these languages. Next, based on the company's estimates of the total market for competitive products in European countries, coupled with CSA Research's eGDP and per capita eGDP figures, it arrives at a ceiling of units it expects to sell. The numbers for Swedish are slightly higher than the overall population, and eGDP might suggest, because of a higher per capita income, that brings more Swedish speakers into the potential market. At this point, looking at these different figures, Rolofont has come up with an idea of what it could sell, and it decides to start with German and then add Italian, Dutch, and Swedish in the next year. So they want to get their feet wet, which makes sense. At this point, Rolofont also consults our analysis of language choice for North American-based enterprises. And here it finds that it already has the top 2 choices, French and Spanish. The bars and what you see on screen show what the top languages are that different companies target. Although this factor, it also finds that companies pardon me. It also finds that companies in the region seem to prefer a Europe-first localization strategy. Although this shouldn't determine its strategy, it helps confirm to the executive team that their approach is consistent with what others are doing. In addition, the chosen languages are all among top choices for North American companies and appear in the same order Oliphant has chosen. So the team deciding on languages notes that some of the languages they've excluded do appear higher in the list, but the underlying economics still indicates that they feel lower priority for that company. However, the company does plan on introducing a less expensive version of its product in 2 years, at which point they may revisit decisions about Russian, Polish, and Portuguese. Based on all the preceding data, Oliphant derives annual sales targets for where the company believes it will be in 3 years after launch in each language market, and here runs into a problem. They estimate that the localization for each market will cost about $75,000, making a strong ROI case for the effort. However, it estimates that it would take about $3 million in initial investment outside of localization for each market to set up distribution and other functions. This doesn't leave, I want to put up the numbers there for what they saw as the potential, and this doesn't leave Swedish really as a viable option. Reluctantly, the company decides to focus on just 3 languages for the time being: German, Italian, and Dutch. Now, I'm going to step away from this example and just mention a service we offer that can help provide some of information on different languages. CSA Research's Global Revenue Forecaster is a tool we have to examine your information about your company and make what's called a ceteris paribus prediction for potential revenue from languages and countries based on your existing performance. I won't go into details other than to say that we have about 8,200 data points we plug into an algorithm to spit out some idea of what you might earn in a given market. It gives a ceiling for revenue if the new markets match existing ones in a company's portfolio, and allows you to get some sense of what's available. And it allows us to do things like deliver prediction about where your current revenue is coming from by language. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. If anybody's interested, you can contact me later. And then it also allows us to break down what the revenue opportunity is by current and potential languages and from additional countries. So I just mentioned that because that's how you can get an idea specifically of what the sales potential is for different countries. Now, moving on past that, it's important to note that the factors I've been talking about really address only the language aspect. Language is, of course, a necessary condition for a lot of international sales, but it's not sufficient. As a result, CSA figures are really just one part in your language selection strategy. When you use them to predict potential sales, you also need to account for costs such as infrastructure, sales and marketing with their own localization, development costs, legal and regulatory compliance, and any other similar factors. You also need to conduct an in-depth analysis of each individual market you wish to enter. So the numbers I presented here in the approach can give you some idea of market potential by language, but each individual market has its own characteristics. For example, if you're in the gaming industry, it's pretty well known that Russians really like strategy games, war strategy games, but French consumers like farming games. And so something that works in one market may not in another. So you really have to focus on these issues. A strategy that neglects these particularities will fail to deliver as expected. Recall that earlier I mentioned in the Oliphant example that it's underperformed in Spain. A careful analysis might reveal factors such as the use of Latin American Spanish instead of Iberian Spanish, maybe that the relevant marketing isn't available in Spain, showrooms are in poor locations, or any number of other factors. So make sure that you address the market entry requirements for each of your targets. You're likely to find that localization is really one of the smaller costs you need to factor in. And investigate the demographics of each country as well. Factors such as age, education level, and family size will force you to adjust the market figures that you gather. And then add anything else that goes into your analysis for your home market into your target markets as well. There's often this tendency for marketing officers to invest very heavily in understanding their domestic markets, and then they just completely ignore all that work in their target markets. And only at that point will you be ready to decide how deeply you'll localize. This is a business decision based on the market size and the investment you can justify, the cost of localization, and all of these factors. Now, in Rolofont's case, it will almost certainly follow the approach we outlined of starting with brand awareness and moving on to product pages. Initial depth is usually quite low, so identify top pages by views and brand value and start with localizing them. So how deeply should they localize? Well, the strategy they're going to have is to start with marketing and brand pages for German. Add in product pages after those are complete. These cumulatively account for about 10% of their total pages. So that 10% figure makes sense as a starting point for them. But after those are complete, it then needs to move on to support. But at the same time, executives realize that much of the effective marketing has come through their social media outreach, and so it decides to prioritize this. Note that what I presented is strictly about web content, and so we can't provide specific guidance in this area, but we do know that similar principles will apply. And so Rolofont's approach should target brand messaging on these platforms and raising awareness. Because the decision was made to hold off on Italian, Dutch, and Swedish, Rolofont does not need to start out with major translation. Instead, it can follow best practices and start developing terminology and some core marketing campaigns for these languages and in anticipation of when it launches. But it can hold off on the bulk of translation until closer to launch in order to avoid rework that might otherwise occur if the English source changes between now and the launch. So I've covered a lot, but let's just go to a brief summary and some recommendations. CSA Research's coverage of language strategy and choice gives you insight into many factors, from economic opportunity to geography, expansion strategy, and how source language matters, and on to depth. The information provides you with a starting point to select languages and decide what you're going to localize. However, balancing these inputs is where your knowledge and your insight comes in. There simply is no one-size-fits-all approach. So when people come to us and say, what language should they add? We always have to go in and do the hard work of an analysis. So you can take the data we provided, the approach I described here, and adapt it to your needs. If you have access to our research, you can download a lot of what I'll show in a moment for your own needs. But if you work with an LSP like Lionbridge, you can consult with them, and they have a wealth of information they can share with you to help you build your language strategies as well. Then you have to plug those into your own calculations and make your own decisions. And I mentioned the Global Revenue Forecaster for those who are interested. That's something we can provide to give you data and help you make your decisions. Here is just a list of some of the reports that I mentioned. A lot of this was conducted in 2019. We're planning new versions for this year. So expect to see more of this later, but we don't expect the overall results to change much. We'll just have greater depth and information on some specifics. And with that, I've reached the end of my presentation, and I would like to open this up to any questions that may have arisen.
Thanks, Arle. We did have one come in, and I'll read it out loud to the group. Is it possible to set a minimum depth for branding, product support pages, especially for companies with relatively higher breadth in languages, for example, 30 languages?
That's an excellent question. I don't have a super easy answer for that. But what I would suggest, if that's what you want to look at, is examine page accesses for support pages or for branding pages and see what people are actually reading. Very typically, you see a rapid curve down, sort of that decay pattern I mentioned earlier, where some things get a whole lot of information and then it rapidly goes down and flattens out to a long tail. So you'd want to look at that and see where that curve is for your company and which pages are being accessed. You know, it would make a lot of sense to access something that 50% of site visitors see. But if 1% C, maybe that's something to hold off on. So I don't have a minimum depth. Just as a gut thing, I'd say for your branding pages, you should probably be approaching 100, your top level branding pages, try and approach 100% page depth. For product, at least the top level product pages, maybe not everything, you're going to want to aim quite high. Support is often quite variable because support is an area where you really have a big differentiation between top pages and ones that are seldom accessed. So that often can be a bit lower. But if you're using MT or a post-editing strategy, you can go much higher. Hope that answers that.
Thanks, Arle. So we'll conclude today's session now. To everyone who listened in, thank you for joining. Our next live stream will be on April 15th on the topic of readiness for EU MDR, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.